Okay, so rounding out this group of talks before we have time for a little break is Dr. Charlene Senn, who will speak about the Enhanced Access, Acknowledge, Act Sexual Assault Resistance Program and the evidence of lasting efficacy in reducing sexual violence that women experience. Dr. Senn is a professor in the Department of Psychology and Women's and Gender Studies program at the University of Windsor, and she is co-founder of the Windsor Bystander Initiative. So please welcome Dr. Senn.
I'm also thrilled to be part of this day. So I was asked to tell you a bit about this program that I developed and the research of its efficacy. Before I do, I wanted to sort of situate this program within all of our greater efforts on sexual violence prevention. We have multiple goals, and this program is just one, so that's why. So first of all, obviously, we want to end perpetration. And unfortunately, with the work of amazing people over many decades, we just aren't there yet. So we are not stopping the flow of perpetrators onto our campuses. We also need to change the culture. And one of the important things we know is that culture change takes time. Even when we think we're in a particular historical moment, those of us who are a little bit or a lot older know that we've also had other moments, perhaps not quite like this one, and then lost ground, frighteningly. We also need to empower bystanders to take responsibility and to intervene, and we have actually made a lot of ground on this on our campuses. But one of the things that we often don't talk about is that, in fact, bystanders are only present in a very small minority of sexual assault situations. So we can't rely on all of these things and not do anything else right now. So until we achieve these other goals fully, and of course also justice, so that when women report or people report that there is justice, every day on our campuses, women are still being confronted by men they know who are attempting to sexually assault them. And so we need another goal as well, and that's to provide girls and women with the information and skills they need to defend themselves against in this reality. So, you can tell from the name of the program that I'm not a marketing expert. Okay? So it's called the Enhanced Assess, Acknowledge, Act Sexual Assault Resistance Program. I called it that to give credit to Patricia Rose and Mary Koss, who came up with this ETripleA, the Assess, Acknowledge, Act piece of this when they were doing a 10-year synthesis of the research and theories on sexual violence in 2001. And you'll see the enhancement later on. It's known as ETripleA for short, or Flip the Script, which is thanks to Sarah Dethridge, one of the first American campuses, working on the first American campus to implement. I developed a program across over almost a decade of work. It's based on, I'm a feminist social psychologist. It's based on the best feminist and social psychological theories and empirical evidence that we had at the time, and it continues to evolve. It's also based, I'm a long-time violence against women activist, so I wanted to make sure that the work of our communities, of our rape crisis centers, and of feminist self-defense work for many, many years was also incorporated. It was from the beginning designed to be inclusive of women in the broadest definition of that word, of all sexual identities, because all women in that context are at highest risk from men they know, inclusive of women of varying cultural and religious backgrounds, and also of women of various physical abilities. So to begin, because women's programs have notoriously been so bad and so woman-blaming, I wanted to make clear what the framework of EAAA is. So in every aspect of the program and in the training of facilitators, this idea of risk is unpacked for young women so that they realize that risk is not in women. There is no risk at all in any situation unless there is someone in that situation who is willing to perpetrate sexual violence. And so that is constantly made, that point is made throughout the program. The other thing that the points that are made are that women are always the best judge of what they could or should do in any situation. And that when we survive sexual assault, we have resisted. That is another important thing. So the program does not tell women what they should or what they should do. It's not prescriptive in any way, and it does not hold women responsible for men's behavior. So what does it do? Well, first of all, let me tell you a little bit about its structure. It's designed for the youngest women in university. As you've heard, this is the group that is at highest risk for 17 to 24 in first year of university. It's 4 3-hour sessions, so 12 hours altogether, either done in 2 weekend days or 2 units a day or 4 weeknights. It's led in small groups by 2 very well-trained expert peer facilitators, so women under 30. And my development of the program was done over many years with the help of many of the graduate students who were facilitators for the early program and research assistants. So to give you to frame this in some way, to think about what is the program actually doing, I'd like you to think about a hypothetical situation, but that actually is based on out of the literature. So there's a situation where a woman answers a knock at her door one night, and it's her roommate's boyfriend. And she tells him that her roommate isn't home, but he insists on coming in anyway. And that feels off to her, but she's not sure. And he comes in and he proceeds to act in ways that are making her increasingly more uncomfortable. But she starts to think about what her roommate will think. Well, all of those reactions are completely normal reactions to danger that is coming at you from a person who you liked and should be able to trust, and in a situation that should be safe, in this case, your own home. But those completely normal reactions actually delay our acknowledgement of risk and our action, and therefore we are at greater danger. So the ETripleA program is actually trying to address this. So what it does is, within a positive sexuality framework, it's designed to decrease the time that women take or need to assess the situation as dangerous, reducing any emotional obstacles they might have to seeing this danger from someone they know and being able to take the action that they need to get away, and maximizing the chance that if they can't leave, that they'll use what we know from the research are the most effective strategies for self-defense. So I'm going to take you very briefly through the program now. Just each one is 3 hours, so I am giving you the nutshell version, okay? You can ask me any questions you want afterwards. All right. So Assess makes explicit the violence, power, and control in sexual assault and explores the research evidence of cues in men's behaviors and in situations that indicate elevated danger. So to give you an example, isolation, as you heard earlier, is a risk cue, and it elevates risk. But most women, and most of us, I think, in the room, probably when you hear isolation are thinking about that underground parking lot, that kind of isolation. But in fact, this kind of isolation, where sound separation is isolating you outside that room, or the movement away from a group of people into an isolated area, is actually more common. And some things in men's behavior, you heard about sexual entitlement earlier, that actually make them more likely to be perpetrators, and persistence, even in non-sexual situations. are also danger cues. So, for example, in the scenario I talked to you about, the fact that he persisted on coming in even when you made it clear that you didn't want him to, you can trust that feeling that something's off. And the isolation of your own apartment when your roommate isn't home might also, because you now know that, might mean that you actually might consider leaving your apartment as a strategy, which most of us would never consider otherwise. The second unit, acknowledge, is basically undoing socialization for nice. Okay, so undo female socialization in the culture in 3 hours. Okay. So what this is really doing is trust yourself. You have a right to prioritize your sexual integrity and safety over other people's possible reactions or judgments. If you think there's something off, it probably is. The research supports you in that, and it's your right to get mad and to resist. So that's what this unit is doing. It's also giving women practice responding to common coercive tactics that are very confusing. All of those things like, you actually like this, those kinds of comments. So women get practice sort of thinking through then what that feels like and what their own personal emotional obstacles might be, and coming up with strategies for themselves. The third unit act is what many young women come into the program wanting. It actually provides women, first of all, with a toolbox of escalating strategies using those that are most effective. So first of all, the first hour is really about providing information that forceful verbal, forceful physical, and actions and leaving are the ones that have been shown through research to be the most effective in reducing the damage to you, the harm to you, and in actually reducing the likelihood that a sexual assault will be completed. And debunking the myths around self-defense, like that you would get hurt worse if you fight back, those kinds of myths as well. And then it's followed by 2 hours of the verbal and physical self-defense, and it is based on collaboration with Windsor Women's Self-Defense, which is 40 years strong feminist empowerment self-defense in Canada. And the fourth session, Relationships and Sexuality, in the early versions of this research came first where it belongs. Right? We all need emancipatory sex education. But in fact, that was too early for young women who were 17-year-olds old. They did not want to talk about these things in the first session with women they didn't know and facilitators they didn't know. So we moved it to the fourth unit, and now it works very well. It's designed sort of for two things. One, to make sure the program is not seen as being about refusal only. Right? This is also about women exploring their own desires, about having the right to initiate sex within a consensual context that they do want as well. So what are our own desires and values, and getting to know that better. Now, how does this fit into sexual assault resistance? Well, we think it's related, particularly in instances of sexual assault by male intimates, because having more knowledge about your own desires and more confidence about those actually means that you detect that coercion much faster in the process. And so you're less likely to sort of move to the nice things for longer and go to the I'm pissed off about this right now. So let me tell you about the research next. So that we did many years, I did qualitative work, I did focus groups and interviews with women who went through the program and who dropped out, and the program was revised, and there were experiments and quasi-experiments, and it culminated in a randomized control trial on 3 Canadian university campuses chosen because they were very different from each other. So for example, on one campus, very unusually for a Canadian university, every first-year student is in residence, and in another one, only 10% of students are in residence, so we did those kinds of differences. Over 900 women participated. If you see that the number is smaller there, it's because some women purposely misrepresented their age when they were being recruited so they could get into the program, and we enthusiastically endorsed that but just couldn't use them for the analysis. Okay. The sample is very diverse and represents Canadian society. In terms of one of the universities is in my home community, University of Windsor, which is the fourth most diverse city in the country. And let me see what else. Random assignment to condition makes it a randomized control trial. And so women either were assigned to get the 12-hour program or to go to what is on every campus at that time when we started, which is a room where there's brochures on sexual assault and you can ask questions of knowledgeable people. So that was the control. You might want to, so the surveys we did the day that you completed, you basically filled out surveys and then went immediately to your session. Then you completed them again 1 week after the program ended, and again at 6, 12, and 18 months. And half of the sample were able to do surveys at 24 months. We ran out of money, as big cuts in grants are not only in the U.S. Our retention, for those of you who do longitudinal research, was 95% at 1 year and over 90% at 2 years. It was like, oh, that's expensive, right? You can't do that with no funding. And the other thing is that there was acceptability to the young women because we had over 90% complete either 3 or 4 sessions. We intended to do an analysis of which session was most critical. We couldn't do it because there was such high attendance, which is good news and bad news. So what did we find? Well, first of all, we needed to look at some things that we know theoretically are really important. And so the first thing is that participation in the program increased the perception that women were at personal risk of acquaintance rape. This was to overcome that optimism bias. You heard about where women will, who are you most at risk from? Everybody will say acquaintances, but then they're like other women, not me. And so that's really important, first of all, for risk detection, right? If you don't think it's relevant to you, then that's a problem. But also because if you're going to sit through 12 hours of programming, you better think it's relevant to you. So what this is moving basically perception of risk from below the midpoint, like no, it's not relevant, it's not going to happen to me, to just above the midpoint. So just into it's possible, not high fear. Okay? Women experienced increased self-defense, self-efficacy, in other words, confidence that if they needed to, they could defend themselves. They also had greater knowledge of what the effective methods of self-defense were in hypothetical situations, and they also were willing to use them at earlier stages of the coercion. And importantly, because this is a program for women, and so many have been woman-blaming, I measured rape myth acceptance and particularly that belief that women are somehow responsible for rape by their own behavior, and found that women's already low rape myth acceptance was reduced dramatically through participation in the program, and that included the belief in female provocation or precipitation. But even more important, many people have been concerned that if you are talking about what is effective in terms of strategies, that if you aren't able to use them or they weren't effective for you, you might actually blame yourself more, right? So that was a concern. I was pretty sure that the content and the way it's done would not do that, but I measured it also to make sure. And in fact, women who experienced a rape after the program blamed themselves less than women in the control group, which basically shows that that was the case. Oh, and I should have said that surprising to me, I expected these effects at 1 year. I was very surprised they were still there strong at 2 years without a booster. So we know that longer programs are better, but we almost never do them. And just so you know, the program was each unit was half an hour shorter, and the effects didn't last to 6 months. So I didn't add content, I added more practice and application. That's where you get these from. Sexual assault outcomes. This was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2015. So the top line, the blue line, is showing the rate, the 1-year rate of sexual violence, this is completed rape only for women who are in the control group, and the red line is for women who took the ETripleA program. So this is a 46% reduction in completed rape at 1 year. Just to put numbers on that, that means only 22 students needed to be in a workshop for there to be 1 fewer rapes. It also produced significant reductions in other forms of sexual assault for at least 2 years. Some people have wondered whether the program would work for survivors. Past programming had not been so effective. In fact, it does. If you'll see the graph on the left, we know that women are at higher risk of re-victimization if they have experienced a sexual assault. So you can see in the control group for women with a prior experience of rape, their 1-year rate was actually 17%. Compared to 7% for women who had not been raped previously, and you can see that the program works for both groups, and so that's how that translates in terms of how many women have to get the education for there to be 1 fewer. And this is for attempted rape, which had a 63% lower rate after 1 year and actually after 2. So what are the next steps? Well, I sort of worked on this for a decade and then looked up and got the results that I was hoping for, hope against hope, after all that work, and realized that most of the people who were contacting me didn't want to do research in any way, shape, or form. So I created a nonprofit and a train-the-trainer model to help get the program out to other universities. I'm currently doing the next step in the research, which is an implementation effectiveness trial. We know that this program works in highly rigorous randomized controlled trial conditions. What happens when it goes out in the world? And so I'm studying, for example, the transfer of training from us to campuses, and then from their campus trainers to their facilitators, and then the effectiveness as it's implemented, and also looking at context differences and also the things that invariably happen, which is people don't do it with fidelity. They decide to change one part, or they decide that it's good for all students, or something like that, all students across years. So we're looking at that as well. Also doing other studies where I just was able to hire a 2-year postdoctoral fellow to work on to do a more deep adaptation for high school girls. I'd done a minor adaptation for girls 16 and older, but so now she's going down to 14 across the next 2 years. She just started, so don't be calling her yet. And looking at, for example, whether it's appropriate based on the research and theory to do an adaptation for our gender fluid and gender non-conforming students of this model, looking at emotional obstacles and so on. And in the U.S., the next step, one of the next steps is that EAAA has been identified as eligible for moving the needle funding from the Laura and John Arnold Foundation, which is pretty exciting to me. I'm not American, but it basically is $1 to $5 million available for the implementation, and then they're going to fund research on top of it. And so I'm working with a group of researchers in the U.S. who have been, in contact with me over the last couple of years, who are interested in studying it further in the U.S., and we're hoping to tap into this money. Leave you with this. Often there's this view that resistance somehow is woman blaming. I say when we resist racism, we never think the person resisting is causing it. This is my message. It's the refusal to accept injustice. Thank you.
Talk. I had seen your article, obviously, but it's great to hear from you and hear more about the framework and philosophy behind it, and it's really great. I had one question about the ACT part of AAA. So as you mentioned, barrier to acting can be just socialization around being nice, but there's also that fight, flight, or freeze, or the tonic immobility response, which is more of a physiological trauma response. So do you address that in the training, or?
We don't. The way that the way the content addresses it is to talk about the transformation of fear into anger. So we specifically talk about that, and about using a big yell to help you with the adrenaline surge to move you from one to the other. So we talk about it in that sense. But underneath it all is that we actually know from, for those people who are doing the neurobiology kind of and trauma stuff, is that actually under trauma we do fall back on habitual responses, right? That's one part of the freeze response. And so if we actually think it through, right, this is the idea, if we think it through ahead of time before we need it, if we practice those powerful moves, we are much more likely to have access to those in those moments and to avoid that freeze response. And if the freeze response happens, women who have been through that unit and the whole program know that it is not their fault, right? It is not their fault. They are not responsible. And we have, in the old days when we used to have writing on surveys, a woman wrote about sort of after that effect, basically being able to throw a man off her after the rape had been completed, but about being able to go and get help, about not feeling shame, about telling people what happened. So there's also that piece.
Thank you.
Yes. No, not at all. Come on.
Okay, so you stay here. So I have a question about transporting essentially the program. Do you have intention to, or are you working on different elements that can be online as opposed to in person, small group, or have you thought about that? I'm sure you have.
Thank you. I am somebody who loves the in-person. Okay, you can tell, right? And I'm not sure which parts. Like there is something about the group dynamic and seeing other women struggle with something, and then seeing them, sort of find their own power, and sort of seeing the women who have no trouble with being angry, and seeing it all happen in the room. That I'm not sure which parts could be modified for online. I know that certainly got some colleagues at RTI who are were very interested in talking about some of the some pieces maybe they could be done beforehand or whatever, but we haven't gone any further on it. So if you've got any ideas, I'd love to hear them.
One last question?
Hi. I was wondering if there was any way you think that this could be adapted into a program to make men self-aware and to encourage them to help women and to recognize how their behaviors could be perceived in a certain way.
Yeah, this program, I mean, one of the things we know about any kind of prevention is that targeted prevention is what works, right? We have to go for what are the obstacles for that audience, and then, or that target group, and then develop it based on good theory and evidence. So for that issue, really, the bystander programs that have highest efficacy are the ones that already address that, right, in many ways. So there's a variety of them, and they are addressing exactly those kinds of issues, and that they would be most appropriate. The only way that EAAA could be, I think, adapted for men might be in the longer run for example, for gay men who are at higher risk of sexual assault by men, where we would have to do the formative research to look at what additional obstacles men face in resistance and in detection of danger and those kind of things, which kinds of, cues of the same, like there's a lot of work that it wouldn't be a small adaptation, it would be like years of work. So I think that might be possible, and just in case, I'm not going to be the one who does it, I don't have that expertise, I'd be happy to work with someone else, by which I mean give it to you, and you would talk to me about it periodically. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.